I'm Wendell Collins, Director of Development at UVA's new School of Data Science. Envisioned as a school without walls, the School of Data Science is dedicated to openness, ethics, and diversity in data science. As a new school, we are growing and hiring a diverse team and actively looking for people excited to help build this dynamic enterprise. We are pleased to sponsor Data's in the Details Week at the Cities Rising Festival, and specifically the important panel on data for social good in Charlottesville. On behalf of the School of Data Science and the TomTom Foundation, I want to thank each of you for being here. This afternoon's event is part of the 7-week virtual Cities Rising Summit event series, which explores critical issues surfaced by COVID-19 and the movement for racial justice. All Cities Rising talks will be recorded. So if you enjoy today's session, please navigate to TomTom's YouTube channel and share it with colleagues and friends. This week is focused on data and machine learning, especially as they relate to applications for social good. Today's panel, Data for Social Good in Charlottesville, features 3 terrific panelists from UVA, including School of Data Science faculty members Jonathan Kropko and Luis Felipe Murillo, and Michelle Claiborne from the University Library and the UVA Equity Center. We invite you to continue this conversation with TomTom and the School of Data Science moving forward on social and at our virtual Data Palooza event on November 13th. With that, I'm pleased to introduce you to our moderator for this afternoon, Virginia State Delegate Sally Hudson. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sally Hudson, and I serve the Charlottesville area in the Virginia State Legislature. I'm an economist by training, and I'm also on the faculty at UVA, where I teach data science and statistics courses in the Batten School of Public Policy, and I'm thrilled to be here today to moderate. Why don't I very quickly give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves. We have 3 wonderful folks with us today, also from the University of Virginia. One of them is Michelle Claiborne from the Equity Center. Michelle, could you tell us a little about your work?
Sure. Yes, I'm Michelle Claiborne, and I'm excited to get to work with UVA's relatively new Equity Center. If you haven't encountered it yet, I encourage you to go check it out. And part of what I do there is really work in this, it's called the Democratization of Data Initiative. And we're very much about opening data. I have a colleague who likes to talk about open data versus opened data. And I just love that language. And we're very much about trying to open, not just have it open, but help people open up what's inside that and use data largely for advocacy and understanding about inequities in the larger community. So.
Fantastic. Well, we're so glad to have you with us today. We have one of your colleagues from the School of Data Science, Jonathan Kropko, who wears a lot of hats around town as well. Here today, I think he's partly here as an organizer for Code for Charlottesville. Jonathan, do you want to tell us a little about that work?
Yes, thank you. Hi, I'm John Kropko. I'm the volunteer lead for a community organization called Code for Charlottesville. Code for Charlottesville is a local chapter of a national nonprofit called Code for America. Code for America brings together volunteers with tech and data and research and design skills to work together on a community service project that uses those skills. We've been in existence for 1 year and we're beginning to get some momentum. We have projects that we've completed with the Legal Aid Justice Center, with the Charlottesville Fire Department, and most recently with a collection of organizations in town that are working on affordable housing. It's very much that intersection of community involvement and tech and data.
Fantastic. And rounding out our trio today, we also have Luis Felipe Murillo from UVA School of Data Science. Luis Felipe, could you tell us a little about your work?
Yes, hello, welcome to our panel. Thank you for the invitation. I am a research associate at the School of Data Science, and I work for the Center for Data Ethics and Justice, where I teach a course on data ethics for the school. And with respect to the topic of our panel, I am helping the school to build a laboratory that we call the Open Hardware Laboratory. But the idea is to build a laboratory for the students to study and help develop technologies, free and open source technologies in the public interest. So we help students interface with projects that are distributed, happen in other parts, happen on the internet and in different cities, states, and countries. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Well, I'm so glad to have all three of you with us as colleagues at the University of Virginia and as engaged members of our Charlottesville community. I know that we're all here because we are passionate about data and technology and also public service. And so as we kick off our discussion today, I think maybe the first question that we often have to ask as we think about pursuing that work when we've got a public service problem in front of us is whether or not it really requires a tech solution. I know sometimes those of us with tech inklings can have a tendency to jump into social problems, assuming that tech can make things better. And that's not always the case. And so it's something we need to keep an eye out for as we do community engagement. Maybe John, you can kick us off with this question. In your experience, how have you found it helpful to try to assess whether or not the problem that a potential partner is posing is really well suited for a technical project, and what sort of pitfalls can we step in along the way?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, in my work, I have a lot of conversations with people in the Charlottesville community and the region, just to see if there's any projects that seem like they could use a tech team, and these Code for Charlottesville projects, we can get like dozens of people with coding ability and design ability all working on the same thing. I think it's important to come to a project like that with some humility, because tech projects require a pretty big investment, not just from the people who are doing the tech work, but from the people we're doing the work on behalf of or working with to do something good in the community. So, there might be a problem which has like a very simple, non-technologically advanced solution, right? Or maybe a solution where the tech maybe wouldn't be considered challenging enough for a team of, say, software engineers, right? That can do a lot of good. But when you bring software engineers into it, then the natural tendency is to make the project bigger, more ambitious than it maybe needs to be. We have to think about what we're asking our community partners and make sure that we are asking them to participate in a way that we can deliver on their investment of time and energy. So for example, if we deliver some software, but we don't figure out how to maintain it and it breaks 6 months from now, then what was the point of doing all that work and doing the project, right? So we have to build something that's lightweight, maintainable. If we deliver something and we don't write documentation to explain how to use it, then again, it's sort of a waste of people's time. So that's one big thing. Think about, is there a simpler way to solve the problem? And find the simplest way to solve the problem. And sometimes that might require software engineering or data science, and sometimes it won't. And if it doesn't, that might be the way to go, because then you're let off the hook to a large degree for these obligations that you should take seriously of documenting what you do and maintaining the work.
Can you maybe share an example from your work, John, or others, of a time where someone came to you maybe seeking a technological solution, and what you ended up doing was sort of dialing down ambitions and going for something that was less than the state of the art, but maybe actually met the user's needs more directly?
Sure. Sometimes it's a matter of an informed decision, like, oh, we need to scale this back, and sometimes it just happens because the initial ambitions give way to practical stuff. So when we were working with the fire department, the idea was to take all of the public data that currently exists on the Charlottesville Open Data Portal and to use it all to generate a measurement of fire risk around the city to help the fire department do prevention and to try and take steps to mitigate fires before they happen, stuff like that. What we found when we dove into the public data portal was that all the data we needed was there, but it was very hard to merge. One table had parcels of land with an ID for every parcel. Another data set had addresses. Another one had addresses, but like, you know, they would write JPA instead of Jefferson Park Avenue, and you had to like match those up. And then another one would have latitude, longitude. And so it became a huge undertaking just to merge the data sets together. And so we had to really take a step back and deal with those initial challenges. So, you know, if you're not scaling it back, sometimes the projects will scale themselves back for you.
I think that's true. I think one of the things I found in my own work is that resisting the temptation to solve the big abstract problem and instead focus on delivering results quickly for someone who needs them tomorrow can often help me hold our teams accountable. We found that when we were trying to figure out how to meet personal protective equipment needs for our community shortly after the COVID outbreak, there was some temptation to try to design the beautiful omnibus website that would host all of the patterns for all of the open source mask development. And we ended up deciding that a Google Doc that had a couple spots where people were just dropping off the masks that they already had in their storage rooms at existing businesses ended up getting people something that they wanted faster, because that was something where we had something deliver and we could do that in 2 days, rather than something that never really came to fruition because the situation on the ground was moving so quickly. I think when those of us, when we know so much about data, sometimes we can have the temptation to do the big thing, like create the beautiful database of our dreams. And that may not actually deliver something anybody needs immediately, or at least in the short term. I wonder, Michelle, if you can talk with us a little about, because I know that as someone who does this work explicitly with an equity lens, I imagine that you're often bridging the gap between different parts of the Charlottesville community. In particular, a lot of the technologists, by virtue of that industry moving so quickly, are sometimes the most recent arrivals to our community, and have sometimes been the agents of exacerbating inequity in Charlottesville. What have you learned about engaging our community in an authentic way while also harnessing the genuine talent that the tech community does bring?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly right. And certainly the work with the Equity Center, right? We try to center the work around questions of equity and more so redressing inequities. And it does, I think, to do that well in a local space means you need to know the local space, or you need to be working with people who know the local space. And here I want to make a distinction that I find super important. One of my colleagues taught it to me about 2 and 3 years ago, the sort of grass tops versus grassroots. When we talk about community, we're often talking about very different things. And it's by and large really easy for us to find partners in sort of the grass tops. And the challenge is getting engagement in the grassroots. And that is always hard, right? Everybody struggles with that for really good reasons. And so I would say some of the lessons that we've learned, first I would say for technologists, the most important part is to enter this work with a great deal of humility, which isn't necessarily something that comes naturally to us, as well as solidarity, right? Those are like the key. If you're not entering with that space, you're probably not going to successfully do equity work around data science. And I'm just going to say that strongly because I'd rather exaggerate it than downplay it. That said, another important lesson that we've learned and is obvious when you think about it, but I only recently encountered some language. Thanks to one of my library colleagues sent me this Black Space manifesto that uses language of moving at the speed of trust. And it so perfectly articulates what I think one of the most important lessons about doing this work in a co-creation and co-liberating way requires, which often means slow, right? We don't get to move fast. And that's, again, not necessarily something that's instinctual to us, right? And so it has to be practiced intentionally, right? Slow it down, move when your partners are ready to move and when you've gained their trust. And so I would say this is one of the biggest challenges, I think, for technology in a community space, if you're not really embedded in the community, is you don't enter with trust. And particularly, again, I'm sorry, I'm gonna go off now around equity. In a place like Charlottesville, we're talking about a lot of racial and class inequalities. And so when that's the work you want to do, it's very easy to be helping on people, right? And in particular, people who do not want your help or do not understand data as something that benefits them. And so the trust is important, and there's a lot of hurdles to it, to gaining that. So for us, part of the benefit of the Equity Center is we have this amazing local advisory committee, right, that we run things by. We have something we kind of call the local data brain trust that we run ideas by, and they help give us a lot of feedback from their networks that they're engaged in. And I would also say it's really hard to get authentic community engagement if you don't fairly compensate people for their time and expertise. And so that's another kind of lesson. We expect people to show up to hear our cool things, but in fact, what we're asking for them is their talent and wisdom. And so we want to have a practice of compensating people for that, for sharing that with us, right? So those, again, that's probably enough lessons, but those are several of the ones I think to really co-create together requires a bunch of things that aren't necessarily what we're taught when we're learning technological skills. But I think they're necessary ingredients to do something really collaborative and useful.
That was so jam-packed with so many beautiful gems that I will be pocketing for life. Moving at the speed of trust is one of the more powerful phrases I have heard in recent memory, and will definitely be stealing with attribution from here on out.
Black Space Manifesto is where I found it.
Wonderful. I need to check that out. So I think one of the really important ideas that you touched on in that discussion, among many, is that we always have to remember that data is an outgrowth of existing social and power structures. It doesn't just drop clean slate like manna from heaven. And so we have to be really cognizant of where our data came from, because we may just be replicating the voices that already have access to the biggest microphones. And I think that that's something that Luis Felipe has done a lot of thinking about in his work, about how do we do data collection in a way that may help some of those voices that aren't often heard as loudly. If we circulate a survey in the Charlottesville community, then it's naturally going to touch the hubs that are plugged into that. If we, as all 4 employees of the University of Virginia, were to send out a survey through our social networks, there's a set of people it would reach, and there's a set of people that it would never touch. And so we need to be really cognizant of where our data come from. And I know that, Luis Felipe, you in particular have spent a lot of time thinking about what we call the Internet of Things, the embedded objects, which can be connected and then be source points for data that would pick up people in more natural habitats, and maybe do a little bit of combating those existing social networks. Can you talk to us about some promising examples you've learned from that, and how it might turn some of those existing power structures around?
Yes, absolutely. I think the first thing that occurs to me is that I think we need to do some work to push back against the very concept of IoT. I think IoT as a rubric, it combines several technologies that don't necessarily have to do, they don't have much in common, right? And that's one part of the problem. But the biggest part of the problem, the most serious part of the problem, is how they're being deployed under the rubric of IoT. So usually when we see deployments that are highly concentrated on big corporate platforms. People don't understand what is being collected, how it's being used, for what purposes the data is being collected. And so there's several problems of accountability, transparency, and access of these technologies. So that's, I think, a big conversation that we need to be having about the role that IoT will play in public spaces. That's one part of the problem. And when it comes to the technical problem, I think IoT is complicated because you go from like baby monitors, which are, connected objects, things that are poorly designed, that have like outdated TCP/IP implementations and security problems, all the way to these corporate networks that not necessarily use internet as a means of communication across for all the nodes. And you bundle them all together, right? So like there's a lot to unpack only under the rubric of IoT. So I think the first thing to do as a group, I think we start examining and pushing back against the notion of IoT and start pointing towards socially positive examples in the space of community networks, which invert the logic of IoT in many ways. because what you're doing when you're doing IoT and playing the IoT game is basically to just give a concession to a big company to come and deploy like thousands of sensors in a location, right? When you're working on a community perspective, what you're doing is taking as a point of departure that Michelle and Jonathan talked about, that is a concrete problem for one specific community. And from that concrete problem, you start specifying the technologies that you need to actually address the problem. So examples of community networks, many of us have been involved in different ones, but I studied one called Safecast that was developed in Japan. And it was a community network that was developed after the Fukushima disaster. So basically, there was a big problem in that context regarding data hoarding. So the Japanese government had information about the disaster, but was controlling the information and not providing information to the public. So that was one problem. And another problem in that space was a serious problem as well, was that the nuclear industry in Japan is heavily corporate controlled, and the government is pretty much like has been held captive of the nuclear industry. So you have like a gridlock, like a control of the space. So a community network that was formed to address the Fukushima disaster by collecting radiation information in that context was huge, because it not only managed to create a common solution that people in the community could adopt and respond to the nuclear disaster, but also managed to push the government to pay attention to these community approaches, right? This is not to say that the volunteer approach is a solution for everything, but there are events, critical events, in which creating a technology that can be well documented and socialized, can be distributed, and can be made accessible, and can respond to a very concrete, urgent problem, such as nuclear radiation, radiation contamination to the public. It's huge. So this is one example that I would bring as a very successful case of community network. But there's several examples. Like in south of Mexico, you have communities that have no cell phone connection, basically creating their own cell phone towers and managing them themselves and operating at like a very narrow band that is unregulated and has not been taken by the big telecom. We have environmental monitoring communities, which is part of the work that we do with the students. We did with the students. Jonathan and I collaborated on this project with the students to connect one project of environmental monitoring in Charlottesville with projects that have been happening in Europe and South America and many other places. So there's several examples. But to make this long conversation short, I think we need to start paying more attention to community networks in order to open the black box of IoT. I think that would be like I think to do that we need to do much more with policymakers and community organizers and academics.
I think that was a wonderfully thorough answer, especially when we remind ourselves once again that there's no such thing as silver bullets in technology. I would love to hear all of you reflect on a point that I think you've all brought up in one bit or another, and also to invite our panelists, or excuse me, our attendees, to jot down questions as you go as well, because we would love to continue this conversation and focus on the things that are most interesting to you. One piece that I think you've all touched on is the notion that there might be some limit to volunteerism, that as excited as we are about the energy of people to contribute on a volunteer basis, that has its limits. And I would love to hear how you've all encountered that in your work. I think, Louis Felipe, part of what you've touched on is the notion that there is the private volunteerism, there is the public sector, and then there's also the big corporate sector. And that sometimes when we don't invest in technology in the public sector and we're stretched a little thin from the good Samaritans, that really it's the big fish corporate data structures that end up carrying the day. I would love to hear, Michelle, you talk a little bit more about how you've seen successful models for making it possible for people to contribute and not expecting them to be volunteers, because there are plenty of people who should be driving this work who simply can't afford to engage in it if we would test their time on a purely free basis.
Yeah, and so I have a couple things that popped to mind about that. One is, there is UVA is involved in the Public Interest Technology University Network Initiative, and one of the goals underlying that is to help create better pathways or clearer pathways for students, in this case, interested in this work, to find avenues of employment that aren't necessarily corporate for-profit sector, to use those skills, is to create those and to develop sort of investment, whether that's philanthropic dollars, but hopefully public dollars towards supporting that work in the public sector. So I think that's an ongoing but nascent sort of effort, right? So there's no question that we're often stuck in a place where, you know, many of the groups we work with couldn't afford to do the work, we, you know, couldn't pay for the work that we do, right? Sitting in a university, we're often able to also leverage students for that, which has a lot of sort of similar limitations to just a general volunteerism, right? And it really has to do with the durability and the stability, right? In the university system, and I think universities should be subsidizing this highly, and part of that's by paying people like me to be accountable partners, to like be the one who's accountable for making things happen, but investing in that work, because, you know, we can't necessarily send a bunch of students out into a community for 15 weeks and hope magic happens without a little bit more planning and infrastructure developed. So I think there's infrastructure that can be developed to help support. You know, I think John working in the lead for Code for Charlottesville is serving in that same kind of accountable sort of position, right? But I think you need those kinds of roles. But absolutely, one of the goals is to sort of, some of the work is obviously proof of concept kinds of ideas to get people excited about advocating for the resources necessary to do this on a bigger scale or in a more sustainable way. And I tend to think of the volunteer work as largely about, if we can think of it not as the end goal, but as the beginning to demonstrate how it might be valuable, I think we're in a better system than if we think, oh, we'll just fix it with a bunch of free labor.
I often find that when I'm supporting my students in that kind of accountable consultant oversight role, is to help them embrace that humility that both you and John talked about up front, and to expect that they are going to be the primary beneficiary of the first project that they do in their learning. And that often what we're doing is whetting their appetite for a career at the intersection of public service and technology. John, when you think about the successful volunteer teams that you've brought together, what do you think has made for a really strong volunteer in this kind of work? And then what do you wish you had in that sort of infrastructure setup that would make it easier for you to do work in a more impactful way?
Yeah, so I think everything we've done that's been successful has been due to a really engaged community partner, so somebody working for the organization that we are trying to work with and help out, who is getting paid for their time, who has a vision of how they can use the product that they've asked us to help build. So with the fire department, we were really lucky to be able to work with Lucas Lyons. With the affordable housing, we're really lucky to be working with Todd Niemeyer at the Charlottesville Office of Human Rights. I think that any kind of project that we would take on just on our own, you know, like the tech volunteers get together in a room, order some pizzas and decide, oh, we're going to solve such and such problem. I think those are always going to be doomed to failure. We need that guidance. We need that partnership. I think my role as volunteer lead is to do everything I can to build those relationships with our community partners and to make sure that that line of communication between our partner and the volunteers is really clear, so that everybody knows what they're working towards, what the real problems are, and what would be honestly helpful. So yeah, that working with the community partner and keeping that relationship really strong.
I had the opportunity recently to work with a really superstar nationwide volunteer corps that I'm going to drop in the chat here, called the U.S. Digital Response. I don't know if folks here are familiar with them, but a lot of them are ex-government officials who are now maybe late in their career or for whatever reason are in between things and have some extra time on their hands. And they've been doing crisis support for government agencies during the COVID outbreak and also the ensuing recession. And in particular, in my role as both a labor economist and a state legislator, they've been supporting states that had this massive influx of unemployment insurance applications. I mean, to 10, 100 times what they were fielding in prior months. And they've been on the hook for trying to help them deal with these really kludgy old systems, many of which are contracted out so they don't have tech support in-house. They have like a major corporate vendor who has built something that is not very agile and not very tooled toward adapting on the fly to new laws coming down from the federal government. And so these wonderful folks have been stopgapping. But it also made me keenly aware that what we desperately needed was more IT folks with their skills in-house in Virginia so that we were less reliant on those off-the-shelf contract vendors. And when I tried to, in our most recent legislative session, put forth a series of budget amendments that said, hey, could we hire 5 of these people and bring them in-house so that we could have a more reliable set of partners like you were describing? So we had that know-how inside of state government so they could even interface with the outside vendors and make sure what we were getting, what we wanted. And I found it really hard to generate excitement about that because we don't have enough technologists in the legislature. Or in, even in the governor's administration. I may be one of the few legislators who's ever written code. And so trying to bring tech into the public sector and understand it as the medium by which we would deliver all services, not as some siloed other thing where we have people who do tech and people who don't, but that everyone kind of has to appreciate it as a platform for interfacing with the public. That has been my challenge. And so if there are folks who are watching who are interested in this work, I am always excited about talking about how do we get people with a tech bent to be excited about roles inside of government so they can be that really engaged, informed partner that John is talking about, because it really does take that kind of speaking the same language across the problems to get those really good public-private collaborations.
I would actually say that speaks to volunteerism too, right? We think about volunteerism as helping the client, but we could also frame it as helping motivate and educate about those possibilities to technical experts in the community as well, right? I think people volunteering in the space should, like you said, Sally, should understand they're getting as much out of this, if not more, than they're giving. And one of the things they might be getting out of it, or maybe we should frame our volunteeristic efforts around, is seeing other paths, right? Seeing other uses for this skill set and understanding their value better.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to say that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Sally.
I think you're absolutely right. And I'm so glad you added that piece. There really is volunteerism in all directions. I would love to make sure that we leave at least some of this time for our attendees to ask questions. If there are things that you would love to hear from the folks who are assembled today, we have these wonderful voices on this panel. Maybe while we're waiting to see what stirs up from the group, Luis Felipe, let me ask you, because I think you raised a really interesting point. We've sort of talked thus far about the public sector as if they're a well-intentioned agent, mm-hmm. but there are also plenty of public sector partners who are not so eager to let go of their data, to open it, as Michelle was discussing. What can we do from your experience to sort of encourage a culture of openness in government? You talked a little bit about kind of pressuring from the outside and hoping that those things sort of filter in by osmosis, but what have you found about, trying to scale that a little bit and make the public sector a more willing partner in this work?
Well, I can speak a little bit about this. I don't have personal experience or research experience on this topic, but I can tell you about a conversation I had just yesterday with a colleague who is starting, she has a long experience interfacing with government organizations and policymakers. She has been working for the Environmental Protection Agency in trying to push an agenda for citizen science for the EPA. And she is responsible for doing amazing work on that front. And we were talking yesterday about this and how we convert our research and our community work into interfaces or pathways for interfacing with policymakers. So we were talking about the ways in which we can translate some of the concepts that we work in our community projects to engage policymakers. And we have like very complicated like conversations about, for example, like the notion of open hardware, right? Which is pretty esoteric, even for folks who are in the tech sector. So how do we convert the importance, like how do we translate, how do we create these interfaces? So I think we have to do much more of that work. We face a lot of pushback from the public sector, from policymakers, because we have, historically speaking, we have a situation in which many actors are, they have been holding this locked-in, corporate lock-in in terms of the technologies and the technology providers that they rely on. And they're all from big tech companies, right? So to break that corporate lock-in, it's extremely difficult to create alternatives that are being produced by community members, by small software companies. So I think part of this problem has to do with this lock-in. And another part of the problem that I think we should advance is start creating these interfaces where we translate basic tech concepts to actually communicate much better across those who are on the public and the policy making side of things.
I think you touched on an interesting specific example as you were discussing that I think is a nice bridge to a question that one of our attendees dropped in the chat about the role of data science in rural areas, where I have so often seen citizen science pop up among environmentalists are in places that are further from our urban areas, our kind of urban social cultural capital centers, and by virtue of both distance and politics are somehow not as connected to the folks who sit on the levers of power. And that's often a challenge when you've got a lot of the tech sector as well concentrated in communities like Charlottesville or in DC or down in the Research Triangle and farther away from those people as well. Have any of you had positive experiences in trying to translate that work and do that kind of equity bridge building across the urban rural divide in addition to within cities?
You know, I'm not going to say that I have, but I want to call out some colleagues at UVA and the Biocomplexity Institute who do this work. The Social Decision and Analytics Division does a work around data science for good, where it's very much connected to the, oh, now I'm going to forget, what are the cooperative extensions across rural areas in several states. And they really try to reach out, and they have a really wonderful and increasingly robust program around that. So I think, but built around the idea that this isn't something that's happened yet, right? This is something we need to learn how to do better, how to extend this to the rural spaces. So I can't speak knowledgeably about it from a personal level, but I do feel like there are some wonderful places that are, you know, even in our community working, well, in Northern Virginia too, working on this, because it's an ongoing problem that nobody's really fully cracked.
And I could speak a little bit on behalf of the wider Code for America network. So one of the big priorities of Code for America chapters in different places is to make it easier for people to access government services. You know, a local or state government might have a program that is meant to directly benefit people who live in rural areas. But there's always like an administrative burden to accessing that. And that administrative burden is often greater when you're further away from a major population center, right? So if you're living in Charlottesville, well, Charlottesville has a pretty good website, City of Charlottesville, and you could always just like hop on over to City Hall and like talk to somebody. But if you're living, you know, a ways away from a big city, you know, it might get very confusing if you're trying to navigate like an internet form for some sort of program like the SNAP program, or you know whatever it might be. Also, in rural areas, you sometimes have just spottier, worse internet, less broadband coverage, and so that also presents a barrier when you're just trying to access these government services. So anything we can do to to make that, to alleviate that administrative burden, to make it easier to work within the programs that are designed for you, that's a major priority of Code for America nationwide.
Yeah, I think that's the chicken or the egg problem, is that you don't want to, you can't embed those connections in rural areas until we have the physical connections to the networks, and that requires major public investment. My hope is that one of the positive outgrowths of the COVID crisis will be that we will no longer ignore our broadband limitations, both within cities and outside of cities, because it has made it necessary for everyone to have better connections so that they can work from home and educate kids from home. And I think that it has vaulted broadband to the top of the list. That's one of those things where we have to admit that there are parts of the country where it will never be a moneymaker to extend broadband, just like it wasn't with running water and electrifying the South. And so we have to make those investments in a form of a public utility, because the private sector will simply not solve that problem for us. It's not meant to. Well, we have a lot of wonderful questions coming in now, and please continue to drop them, because we want to make sure we get your questions answered. Luis Felipe, I think one of them is touching on something that you were beginning to talk about at the end of your last response, and I wonder if we might go further down that path. This idea of communication between folks with data and tech skills and with community partners. What sort of experiences have you had that you found helpful, either workshops or educational opportunities or good bridge builders, or, what have you learned maybe about gaps that we also need to fill to make it easier to do that work?
I think the first part of this, of an answer, a potential answer has to do with what we were talking about in terms of privilege and with respect to volunteerism. So we have like this coin, like of two sides of volunteerism being very, it takes a form of privilege to be able to engage in a voluntary type of work, right? So you need to be free of work to be able to engage in many cases. But the other side has to do with communication and education, which has to do with producing in community projects that we run with free and open source technologies. We produce public resources, right? We cultivate a commons of resources, of software, of data, and now of hardware design files. So we have those commons that we have been building, cultivating. And the other side of this is that we actually get to learn a lot by engaging with open projects. So I think we're now realizing how important it is pedagogically for people to actually participate more in these projects, and for us to create less elitist barriers of participation in these projects. So communicating better, like how we go about solving a tech problem, documenting better the work that we do, like making things more accessible, like opting for things that are easier, like languages that are less complex, like libraries that are less complex. Try to tame complexity, and I think those are all the steps in making projects to communicate more, and to become more open, more accessible, and then to solve these divides that we see in tech projects, and the difficulty of getting people to participate. So I think we're now much more aware than we were, let's say, 10 years ago. And educational potential and the potential for the public benefit of what we do in these community projects is just like, immense. So
sometimes simplifying can flush out quickly those assumptions that John and Michelle and I think all of you have talked about, that folks from a professional technical background might make, that might be ill-suited toward the problem at hand.
mm-hmm.
Were there others who wanted to comment on that, about what they found to be successful strategies for encouraging effective communication between project partners, or maybe needs or ideas for how we could fill gaps that exist?
I would definitely second Felipe's, like, the importance of documenting, and I'm going to especially reaffirm the idea of accessibility. We talk about this a lot, about making the work accessible, not just in a way that people can find it, but can use it, right? Making it readable and understandable. And I think we have I think that's on us, right? We have to engage that intellectual challenge of communicating it in a really accessible way. And sometimes that's even linguistic accessibility. Like we need to think maybe not everybody's going to encounter it in the language of our choice, right? I think we need to spend the time on that. But I would also say part of where I wanted to go with that is one of the most exciting sort of possibilities is often around bringing youth into projects. There's a lot of interest and excitement and talent and an ability to shape interests in ways that might be more publicly oriented, working with youth in the community. And they're often just wonderful, like locuses of some places you're going to learn, right? And building that capacity in your own community can often start by, working in collaboration with various other sort of youth partnerships to bring young people into this work early.
So I think that we are beginning to near the end of our time, and I would love to give each of you an opportunity to offer any closing thoughts or wraparounds, whether it's a reflection on something that we've already covered or a charge for our attendees about where they can go from here, whatever it is that you'd like to leave our audience with. I'd love to give you a chance to say it. John, maybe do you want to kick us off again?
Sure. Yeah, just I guess on the last question, I want to talk a little bit about the project that we have going on right now, which we're calling the Housing Hub. One thing that's really cool about this project is our main point of contact is Todd Niemeyer at the Charlottesville Office of Human Rights, but he's sort of like the hub of the wheel in a way, because he's not only the main point of contact to us, and like the tech team, but he also has a working group of all the people who are working on housing insecurity in Charlottesville. So this Housing Hub group, it involves people from city and county government, from Habitat for Humanity in the Haven and Potcham. It's really cool. These sorts of community groups that bring people together, they exist. They're really healthy in Charlottesville. Charlottesville is got a very vibrant civic culture. I think that for people like us with a more technological point of view, the best thing we can do is, instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, let's just participate. Let's join these civic organizations and just listen. Go to the meetings and hear what people are working on and hear what people are concerned about, and meet as many people as we can. And that then we can start to build projects like this housing hub that we're working on, where we're not just getting direction from one person, which is great, but it's a lot to put on one person. We're getting feedback from a whole network of people, and I think that more than anything else is what's helping us to make this project a success. So the one takeaway is get involved with the stuff that already exists here. It's a great town.
I think that's absolutely true. We are really just blessed beyond measure with excited folks and resources here, however you want to plug in and engage. Luis Felipe, did you have any parting thoughts for us?
Yes, I would just like to, again, thank you for the invitation to join you all in this amazing conversation exchange. I would say that I would just, put in a word for for us to just continue to work on common resources, like attending to the commons, the electronic commons, and in the process of doing so, cultivate this idea that we're not just volunteering, we're building like these common resources that are important, for our present and future. And that concerns like everything, right? Like our ecological future, it concerns our technological future, the possibilities that we have for future education. So I think a lot of it depends on our capacity to attending to the commons, to these public resources in the format of software, data, and hardware. So John was speaking to all these projects. Michelle also works in several projects along these lines. And I have a few that I'm also collaborating and volunteering for and doing research about. So I think that's what I would say, like, let's continue to work on this together and addressing the problems that we see, taking as a first step the realization of how privileged we are of having the opportunity to actually give ourselves into these two volunteering projects. And that's a first step to realize the power differentials and problems that we encounter in these projects to provide more access to more people. So that would what I would say as a closing remark. But it's to be continued. Our work and our good trouble together continues on, and we'll continue to work on this.
Absolutely. Thank you. Michelle, did you have parting words for our audience?
Sure. I think I would, I love everything John and Felipe have said. And on the one hand, would second the fact that even if we're technologists, we're also citizens of this space, right? And we need to understand ourselves as that, not some rarefied kind of other breed. But that comes down to the idea that, I think we need to understand, again, data science and technology and data is not neutral, right? It's value laden. And as we approach projects, we need to learn how to understand the values embedded in that, whether it's in the source of the data or the methods we choose to use or the problems we're trying to solve or the questions we're asking. I would just encourage us to not think of ourselves as neutral actors. We're not, right? And the more we can understand our work is also around advocacy. I think the closer we get to a better place for everybody. And so I would encourage us when we engage these projects to think too about values like equity and justice, which can often make the work look different, and it can certainly make it slower and it can make it messy, right? But I think the sooner we acknowledge the need to do that, and that just working sort of to the side isn't a neutral choice either. It looks different. I think the closer we'll be to actually figuring out how to share power and utilize this work to sort of turn the tables. I would like us to be using this work to be surveilling and holding accountable leaders and corporations and those in power. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all three of you for sharing your experience and your expertise and all that you bring to our community. It's so wonderful to have project partners like you to lean on as we do this work together. I will just close then with a couple quick housekeeping things. We have a meet and greet that we can hop into in another Zoom room if you want to hang out and continue the conversation from there. I know that I will go spend a few minutes there after we wrap up here. And with that, I will just say thank you to all of you who joined and hand it over to Chelsea from TomTom, who can wrap up for us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was amazing. And we would like to thank you so much. And everyone else who attended today, thank you for being a part of this. This event is part of a full week of programs focused on data and machine learning at Cities Rising Summit. Today and tomorrow now we have a full day of flash talks and panel conversations. We encourage you to attend and share the opportunity with friends and colleagues. Today's program was brought to you by S&P Global, who we thank for their support and collaboration. All these events are pay what you can thanks to the support of our sponsors and community members like you all. So if you enjoyed today's program, we invite you to become a contributing member of the foundation. And with that, thank you all again, and we'll see you very soon.